You just saw her keynote presentation from earlier this morning. She's principal researcher at Microsoft Research and founder of Data and Society. She's co-authored 2 books and more recently has focused on how contemporary social inequities relate to technology and society. Danah Boyd, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So one of the things that you said in the keynote that was interesting to me was really thinking about the context as journalists, not just the content, right? And you started to talk about how we should be looking at network effects and things structurally. Explain that.
Sure. So most technology, especially the social media systems and the search engines, actually thinks first and foremost in terms of networks. It tries to read in networks, it tries to produce networks. And as scholars, we think about this in relationship to folks like Manuel Castells, who talked about how power is rooted in the ability to make networks. Most of us who work outside of this logic don't think in terms of networks. We think about reaching somebody, we think about groups, we think about content. News, for example, is entirely focused on thinking of an audience, a group that you reach, rather than understanding how that information is situated within a graph. And so part of what's been interesting to me is to watch manipulators really understand the graph logics, and then to say, what does that mean for all of us who are building things? And then the flip side is, how do we understand the context? And we see it across all of these different dimensions. So my colleague, Robin Kaplan, she spent a lot of time looking at content moderation and realized that you can't do content moderation if you think about the content. You have to think about the context. So she talks about context moderation. The same is true with regard to getting information out. If the news industry is in the business of amplifying information, it's not just about yelling louder or building more audience explicitly. It's about imagining that everything you do is within a network, within a graph. And so the early versions of it were virality, just get it out there. But it's actually about thinking about the systematic relationship between those networks.
So in a way, we're in the business almost of amplifying discord, right? I mean, because we end up looking for people with different perspectives and points of view, but at times we're essentially turning up the heat by giving them more real estate.
So it's yes, and the idea that there are sides means that you architect what those sides are.
Sure.
And actually, most issues are far more complicated than sides. And so by trying to then position that there are two sides, you are shaping the network to be bipartisan, to actually have split or by whatever version. If instead you're trying to say, hey, how is this information flowing? Given this different way of thinking, how does this community come in? How would the same issue be looked at from a different perspective or worldview? How do we negotiate all of those perspectives? That's more network thinking. But it's very hard to do that because if you're not a subject matter expert, you don't know the topology of that information landscape. And this is where we've shifted from a world where we have beat reporters, people who really know the ecosystem, to people who one-off are supposed to become experts in 24 hours on a topic, enough to cover it. So they're looking quickly for divergent views, rather than actually seeing that this is something that is topological.
And sometimes, and you also pointed out in the keynote that essentially search, and specifically in the context of YouTube search, is a large part of how almost a generation gets its information. So when they look at YouTube search, there's a difference in how YouTube search results come up versus how Google search results come up, and I don't think most people realize that.
Right. So part of it is that Google circa 2001 didn't have that much content, but most people weren't on it in that period. And so when they searched for something that was a failed result, everyone laughed. It was funny. YouTube is in a position where it doesn't have nearly as much content as what Google has been able to do, because everything about YouTube is what's on the site.
Right.
And as a result, it enables all sorts of what Michael Golubetsky calls data voids. These are spaces where the information is not available, and as a result, it's a moment of exploitation. And these, again, are back to thinking about in terms of graph. A lot of what affects search is how you ask the query in the first place. And this goes back to even thinking about what news produces. So as a journalist, if you are covering, for example, the current scandals around sex abuse in the Catholic Church, you probably make reference to things like the Vatican and sex abuse. But you may not use the term pedophilia, right, for all sorts of interesting historical reasons. Now, if you go to a search engine, and if you search in Vatican pedophilia versus Vatican sex abuse, you're already going to end up in two different worlds. right? Because the whole point of a search engine is to try to say what is the language you're using and what is the information that's most relevant to you. Because what they're trying to do is give you a portion of the graph in a ranking order. The same is true with YouTube, which is a search engine, a recommendation engine, and a social media service. And so when you start out that perspective, you end up already in a place that may not be the same as other people. And as a result, you start out in a fractured place. And then in YouTube, you don't just have your results, you have your recommendations. So it doubles down and it goes deeper into the frame that you're already in. And that's how you end up in these very fragmented universes of information.
And sometimes you're saying that the frame is almost defined by very tiny extremist or conspiratorial communities. You know, one of the things that you said that struck me was strategic terms like crisis actors, incel, caravan, globalist. These are all actually terms that came into our mainstream media lexicon from people who had an agenda in the first place. And when people search for that, all of a sudden, they're being pointed back to that.
Right, so there's terms like this that come from extremism. They're rooted in really hateful orientations, and they have an agenda to them. Let's also acknowledge that there's a lot of terms that come for more contemporary political purposes. And a lot of what I hearken back to is some work that a Republican operative by the name of Frank Luntz did when he was working in the 1990s trying to get journalists to push out a frame by getting Republican members of the House to actually speak under his terms. And it was very, very effective. So these are more mainstream uses. What's notable is that extremists have learned that more mainstream communications ability and scaled it to take extremist logics into the mainstream. But it's also, let's acknowledge that how people search is also affected by terms that they pick up. So, you know, my colleague Francesca Tripodi spent a lot of time listening to how talk radio communicates different issues. And they encourage their listeners to use specific terms. And those terms might be very different than what you hear in other media outlets. And so again, you're back into these different worlds. And so it may not be an extremist perspective. It may come from whatever different cultural logic. But once you start into a segmented part of the network, where are you going to end up?
Is there a way that working journalists can figure out whether a term is coming with political baggage already attached before we use it in a story or a headline?
I mean, my first recommendation is just, if the term is new to you, pause before you use it. It's very simple because it's like, where is this coming from and why? Who is winning by this term? And that's antithetical to the immediate instinct, right? Because there's something catchy about the new term, the new concept. You want to push it forward. And so it requires a level of friction in the kinds of thinking. I also think that there's a lot of work to be done within the field to say, okay, what are the unintended consequences of our good intended reporting? And that work has been done historically, for example, with coverage of suicide. The World Health Organization worked across with journalists to say there are ways of reporting on suicide that are responsible. It's not about not covering that someone died by suicide, but do so responsibly. Think about how you make the best recommendations. Don't put it out in the headlines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're at a moment right now where, as a field, everyone needs to come together and say, okay, we all have the best intentions. What are the consequences of us going in certain directions for competition, for economic benefit, for clickbait, whatever the reason? How do we step back and say, what is the damage that we could cause? And that form of reflexivity is something that's really important, both for the tech industry to be doing, right? What are the unintended consequences of our actions, but also for the news industry?
You know, so even if you could get everybody in this room and all of the places that are associated with everybody in this room together to agree on that rules of the road, so to speak, there's always going to be this outlier that essentially says, great, that's just less competition for me. I can clickbait and game the systems even faster, right? So that connection between what a social platform sees as an important signal is pretty important, especially when it comes to how search looks at the world and or how results of search help people view the world.
Well, this is one of the reasons I believe you want to understand the structure of these systems. So, for example, the Southern Poverty Law Center realized that people were sharing all sorts of Holocaust denial content.
Yeah.
And the result is that they decided to start making content to inform people. But they used the terms, they used the language within their content making so that people who were searching for hateful speech would encounter their work. There's a lot of work that the news ecosystem going to do? Be like, you may have heard the term this by the time those terms propagate, or maybe it's not even put on their main news station. It's put within social media. It's put within search to be like, you're searching for this term. Let me explain to you why this is actually, a hateful term or something that's actually meant to make you afraid. Let me inoculate you against this kind of logic. So there's a difference between deciding to resist or challenge some of these concepts and deciding to propagate them because they are the norm at the moment.
So how do you balance out what is hate speech versus free speech versus inaccurate speech with intent or without? So because people are going to say, well, that's great, you're essentially sanitizing the internet or sanitizing the world, especially if you have strong views. I'm pro-science, believe in climate science, and there's somebody that wants to deny it. They're like, well, you're restricting me now.
So Louis Brandeis actually contended with this in the early part of the 20th century. He was a Supreme Court justice, and before that he was a lawyer. And one of the things that he struggled with was what are the boundaries of free speech? He is one of the biggest advocates of privacy, but he's also one of the biggest advocates of transparency. In a particular case called Packer versus Utah, he argued that the people who had the ability to amplify messages into the public had a different responsibility than anybody who wanted to speak on the corner. And so he ruled that advertisers who wanted to amplify smoking messages didn't have the right to a billboard because it affected the entire public sphere, but that was different than advertising even in a magazine. The reason I bring us back to that time is to say that there's a very different set of responsibilities for anybody in the business of amplification, the tech industry, the news industry, etc. Just because you have the right to speak does not mean you have the right to be amplified. And that's where we have to start thinking about who is doing the amplification and what are the different kinds of ethical societal responsibilities for amplification and how do they differ from the ability to speak.
All right. Danah Boyd of Microsoft Research and Data in Society, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.